How does an idea start in a university and eventually end up in the real world? My guest today is Alex Sheppard, who has close ties to Oxford University innovation teams and knows this world well.
I would say that Oxford University might be among maybe certainly the top 3 or top 5 universities in the world. But in terms of public market value of Oxford University spinouts, we're looking at $8.5 billion in public market value. In 2001, Stanford had about $500 billion in public market value.
Now a startup founder, an investor, an industry expert.
Probably about 95% of the journey for an innovation happens in the academic lab.
And really knows the innovation landscape well. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Alex, maybe the first question I'd like to ask you is, how does an idea start in a university and eventually end up in the real world?
Yeah, it's the kind of critical question. I think the days of a professor waking up in the bathtub one day, running to the patent office with their idea in hand, I think is over. I think we're looking at a phase now where we have essentially a series of nodes that are interconnected and more what I would kind of see as empathetic innovation requiring cross-disciplinary support. So teams in universities that might be bridging the gap between advanced computation and maybe medical sciences that can actually come together and collaborate. But I think the core ingredients for innovation within that kind of initial kernel of ideas that might emerge within academic labs and also even corporate laboratories really comes down to essentially talent, capital, insight, and the interface between these 3 things. But in particular, in my view, is how they are interfacing with each other. And because often what you might see is that these core components might not be as well connected as it might appear. An incredible example of this might be when we look at the world's top academic institutions and we look at the ratio between that and, say, public market value, you can often actually see enormous disparities. Many would say that Oxford University might be among maybe certainly the top 3 or top 5 universities in the world. But in terms of public market value of Oxford University spinouts, in one of the latest reports around sort of 2021, we're looking at $8.5 billion in public market value. Compared against in 2001, Stanford had about $500 billion in public market value. You would argue those institutions surely don't have this enormous gap in, say, academic output and capability and deep science, but there's this enormous disparity. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting as we're now embarking on sort of new century of innovation. I actually think one of the examples you gave about the vaccines is super, super compelling and interesting in the sense that it almost harks back to the almost 20th century big industrial innovation projects like the Manhattan Project, like Xerox PARC, where you're looking at these serious densities of globally impactful minds coming together to work on one really huge intractable problem. And we saw, of course, the science of mRNA and vaccines have been around for actually quite some time, but not actually deployed. COVID then enormously accelerated that. And I think that some of that drive and urgency by bringing together these 3 components I described I think that's what's going to really transform it and get things into the clinic faster, but also hopefully build ourselves a new pipeline of deep innovation for this century.
We have a lot of innovation happening in university, brilliant ideas. Who needs to come together for these ideas to be commercially successful and really have the impact on our lives?
So I think it's all about connectivity. Too often we see silos being curated, whether it's by discipline or whether it's by capability. So in the sense that your PhDs, your academics, your investors, your university authorities, and even then subject matter experts, perhaps in healthcare, might even not be within that academic environment. How can you build and harness connectivity between these core nodes that are required to make innovation happen at scale and improve that surface area? That is the crucial aspect, is to reduce these silos and build systemic approaches where you can have that connectivity built in from the start, and that the type of connection is really carefully curated and geographically proximate. So essentially not a diffuse team that's working over 5 continents, but actually sort of almost small units that can be collaborating and co-developing together with customers really early in more dynamic and close-set environments.
Wow, you covered really a lot of points there. I'd like to drill into a couple of them. So one is the disparity between the US, say Stanford and Oxford. One point I think you made is really around how multiple people need to come together for innovation to be successful. Maybe a good point to start is with your personal story.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't mind me saying, you were an accidental CEO
Yes.
of a health tech spinout. Like, what did that look like kind of on the ground? I know it was a few years ago, from being in academia and then taking that into the commercial world.
No, of course. So I started my career actually in Manchester, where I had worked on a number of Innovate UK grants for a very early stage kind of spin out of the university at the time, and effectively won these grants. And they said, oh, actually, feels like you'd be quite useful to have on the inside of the company as it's kind of growing. And this is, a classical example of a professor, a couple of PhDs, and then in my case at this time, sort of young, hungry, more operationally focused person to come in, learn the ropes and start to build it. And you then quickly realize that actually probably about 95% of the journey for an innovation to come to application happens in the company stage versus in the academic lab. And I think this is often one of those misconceptions that comes up around, well, actually the invention is there, the publication is made, job done. Actually, that's really just where it starts. And I think that's often been one of the challenges in Europe, in the sense that this came out to some degree in the spin-out review, but I think actually we almost need to go significantly further, in the sense that actually universities look too much on the work that has been done so far, rather than that cap table in a spin-out being an investment in the future. Because the key thing is, it's like a rocket ship. You've got to prep for this journey across the galaxy. And the guys that built the ship, that's great, but we really need to be thinking about who are the astronauts that are going to go on this voyage, right? And that they're incentivized, they're looked after, and things like this. And there used to be this concept in Cambridge around golden shares to try and protect cap table. Of course, it's not really an ideal solution necessarily, but certainly with academic labs in the US, their take in terms of equity stake at the start is significantly lower than you tend to see in Europe in general. And I think it's only one part of it, but it's essentially a part of this trend around building really kind of founder incentivized and led businesses, which has been a huge driver of a lot of the hypergrowth companies, even in deep tech space over the last 10, 15 years. From my perspective, kind of being in that environment, first as essentially almost like a first hire, but then later in my career in the last 4 years, actually being a co-founder of an entrepreneur first company, you kind of see both sides of that coin, and actually you see, well, how could you adapt some of these almost more, I suppose, like quite dynamic ideative environments that you see in companies that are just set up outside of the academic sphere? How can you build more of that into that area? Because often you find a lot of my friends who set up spinouts, you ask them, well, what was the process? And it took them 12 months to get approvals from the university, maybe 6 months to get the permission of their supervisor to perhaps be an advisor or take some advisory shares. This slowness and this wait for capital is also a bit of a killer, because actually a lot of startups, if you're not seeing traction within the first 3 to 6 months, you can lose some of that crucial momentum in that initial ideative phase that can then kill potentially amazing ideas or amazing teams. I think the other piece as well that can't be underappreciated is the pivot rate, even in deep tech, is enormously high. So the university that might be sat on 40% or 30% of the company, in reality, in 5 years' time, this company could be doing something wholly, like enormously different to what they might have originally set out to do. And I think that's about really investing in team and talent and ensuring that you have access to good enough capital as well early, so that you can maintain that momentum of innovation.
Like your early experience as a young CEO who probably didn't know what they were doing, right? Because you learn on the job. You left academia, you took on this role of CEO of a health tech company, and then you were growing that company and trying to kind of commercialize it, take it from an idea to something that's commercial. What did that journey look like, and what were your kind of maybe key learnings or key insights of the differences between, say, academia and taking this thing into the real world and making it live?
100%. I think in particular one was about customer centricity and about bringing potential users early in terms of product development, because often something that's construed in an academic lab to some degree. And so in this case, it was an imaging type of solution that had a really strong publication record, but at this stage hadn't been seen the sort of the fires of kind of industry and involvement with, kind of key customers. So that was absolutely central to helping to build the proposition, because of course you have to be really solving a point of extreme pain for people that's so painful that they need to action it. We often used to call this the what is the hair on fire problem, that needs a bucket of water now, not, oh, well, I'm just slightly singed and I'll deal with it next week. It's got to be urgent. And, often you want the signs you want to see in the customer are things like, this is so painful. I learned coding just to build a product to solve this pain, and it's terrible, and I wasn't supposed to do this in my job. And you want to find these kinds of things because that's kind of crucial. And so often that's why sometimes on the spinout side, you run the risk of becoming kind of solution in search of problem, whereas actually it's completely the inverse of that. But incidentally, a lot of the time from academic labs, you have really interesting platform capability that gives you quite a lot of creativity when you then go into this phase of solution development and understanding how you can then utilize, say, like a new tech capability, whether it's in metamaterials or semiconductor, and how that can then apply into kind of industry problems.
When you talk about platform capability, what do you mean? The solution has broader applicability than
exactly
the specific use case in hand?
100%. And then understanding that really carefully in terms of how perhaps a new technological innovation that might have been developed, creatively understanding how that then actually solves real-world problems. They often are developed with real-world problems in mind, but often with sort of these kinds of leaps on the deep tech side, you can often find that there's interesting challenges that you might not realize that this new capability can be applied to. And that level of adaptability and creativity is really key. I mean, so in my experience, we started out with an innovation that was really targeted at the life sciences market and was built to do that. It was built to image viruses. But then actually, when we started investigating markets and talking with customers, we soon realized there was actually a really big problem in the semiconductor industry, to which this product actually could then solve their problem much more adaptively. And you also found quite a compliant procurement environment too. And so there then became this really interesting confluence of kind of commercial push factors as well as also technical ones, which made that quite exciting. And so this is one example, but there are so many where you can see that adaptive component, as a real driver to change early in the company's life.
Is there a difference in alignment from I don't know, the university professor or researcher who kind of developed the concept were thinking about it maybe in the health context, and then as you went on, you saw an opportunity in semiconductor when you're thinking about it really from a commercial context? Is there conflict there, or are they just happy that their idea is useful somewhere?
I think it's one of these things. The other phrase that's used a lot is strong idea sort of weakly held, in the sense that you want to sort of not be so wedded to a particular sort of pathway to the onward deployment of technology or success, that it kind of gets in the way of that early deployment and traction. I think that is almost like a crucial thing. So yeah, of course it does create that debate that needs to be had. You have to justify why you think there's this pull factor, why it might be making sense. And that's the right conversation to have. But I think within the startup frame, you have to have this adaptive component. I think without it, it just is almost impossible to make that leap.
Just going back a little bit to your kind of personal story, early in your career, you were the CEO of this company, you pivoted to semiconductors, and then eventually exited that company. And that was kind of the completion of the journey there with that.
So in that company, the play ultimately turned into an IP licensing play where you could create a matrices of license deals into different corporates within the same environment. And that ultimately turned out to be quite a good path for the company, because often you find with, let's say, hardware focused or hard tech innovation, it is actually a misnomer that they require a lot more capital than software companies, but you often find that in terms of manufacturing your own equipment and making this leap from academic lab into, say, ISO 9001 or ISO 13485, so highly regulated hardware constructive companies, that can be quite a challenge. So licensing then in co-development with big companies then becomes extremely attractive, because you can then, in a more capital light environment, work with them and make that happen.
That's really interesting. So that kind of outlines there are a few different paths that a university could take, or an idea takes to commercialization. On the one you described, which was your personal experience, which was really, we have an idea, let's build a company, let's try and commercialize it. But then that led to something else, which is you commercialized it in a different way, which was through IP licensing.
Yes.
Are they the only two paths, or are there others that you can think of?
Well, I think one of the key ones, and what I'd done with the company that I then went on to found after the university spin-out, it was actually going direct and doing the manufacturing yourself, setting that up, and then actually going direct into healthcare providers, and actually then building that capability completely in-house, end-to-end. And in some cases, that level of vertical integration and control over your innovation actually gives you a bit more ability to steer things, actually, because often with, say, co-development, you then also have internally this dynamic between your partners where you have to work together, you have to collaborate and almost co-build the product. Whereas with some deep tech applications, having more vertical integration and control over your product then actually, I think, can sometimes help with faster delivery if you're then doing the direct go-to-market yourself. So I think that is also extremely common with deep tech companies, especially that where they're very IP rich, and perhaps the licensing play is either not a priority or perhaps a secondary source of revenue. And actually there's better and smoother pathways to go direct.
Your view in academia, this sounds pretty sophisticated, right? Like, there's a lot of things to think about. Probably my image of, I don't know the academic world very well. That's a long time since I was there. And even when I was there, I wasn't very academic. A little bit in my mind is kind of, a few students in a lab or a professor and thinking about a cool thing, but not very sophisticated from a, say, commercial perspective or a strategy perspective. Are universities set up to kind of commercialize and be aware of the different avenues they have to commercialize the ideas that they have?
So I think the picture is extraordinarily mixed. I think actually the level of capability on that side is very up and down on an institution by institution basis. I think that's actually one of the big challenges. I think going back to what we said at the start around these kind of core three components that are needed to generate that innovation, I think often, so say in terms of talent, ideas, and capital, these are often not actually that well connected. They're all there, they're all present within the ecosystem, but they might not necessarily be co-located. For example, in Stanford, you have Sand Hill Road over the way, which is essentially full of venture capital investors. You probably have the highest density of funders perhaps in the world. And then you also have this extraordinarily high-performing university. And that level of geographic density of these componentry around innovation, I think, is one of the big precipitating factors for why it might be more successful there versus in other locations. But I think, and so you'd also argue Cambridge in the UK is actually a really good success story in terms of, how they've been able to drive some really compelling computationally driven companies and also in biotech perhaps too, that perhaps more so in Oxford on that latter side have come through in Cambridge and driven quite a lot of value, in part as well because you have, I would say, better co-location between, say, capital, insight, and talent there than you do perhaps in other institutions. But the key thing then is even if they are co-located geographically, they have to interface in the right way. And so you often have challenges in universities with, say, some tech transfer offices might not be that well set up to help students with spinouts, for example. And you can see blockages there. Or equally perhaps because often with spinouts, it's not necessarily always driven by the professors. Often this is actually driven by students on the ground. They're like, I've just done my PhD. This is ready to go. This is ready to set up a company around. And some of these companies, maybe a few years ago, would have been spin-outs. Today, actually, sometimes they're not. And actually, these students can leave the university ecosystem, build more on their own, and then move more rapidly outside of the strictures of some of these ecosystems. And I think then as a result, perhaps in some cases, both lose out. You gain a lot of agility, though. And I think that's one of the key things around university architecture is that my view is that universities aren't performing the role that perhaps they used to historically in the innovation world. And I would argue perhaps the same is true even for corporate innovation, government innovation. I think we see it's at least almost like a 5x reduction in spend by governments on innovation and investments in, whether that's new green energy technologies, like even nuclear fission and nuclear reactors and other kinds of things that you would expect governments to be drivers of, often aren't. And so historically over the 20th century, I think the role of governments, universities, and corporates within the innovation world declined quite substantially. It used to be that corporates would have more patents than any company on earth. Say like even PepsiCo or Coca-Cola would have this enormous array of innovation that they'd be doing. Today, you would argue what synthetic biologist graduates maybe from Imperial and thinks, oh, I want to go and work for Pepsi. It almost seems, just completely crazy. But arguably, maybe they should be or should have been historically based on the role that these companies and also universities would have played in the innovation ecosystem. And then I think the other challenge is that venture capital was invented really kind of it pioneered really in the mid-20th century as a new asset class and ultimately cut its teeth on semiconductor innovation. And that built enormously influential companies around. I mean, obviously, we talked a bit about Xerox PARC and obviously Silicon Valley has emerged out of that. And that introduction of new asset class was one of the seeding factors for deep tech innovation there. But one would argue, if you look at big funds across Europe, US, what primarily they're investing in actually is, I would argue, is like not so much really hard science innovation anymore. A large proportion of portfolios, you would at least say half of it or 40% or so, would be in much lighter kind of software or adaptive or operational innovations that are still really challenging to execute, but aren't based on, say, deep science innovation. So they aren't things like biotech or synthetic biology or really deep artificial intelligence applications, though, of course, in the last couple of years, that's probably the only area within deep tech that's seen vast growth in capital. And so I think there is room for us to think critically about what is required for new innovations that's going to accelerate, let's say in healthcare, their path to the clinic, and what entities are going to play that role. Because arguably at the moment, I think there's almost been a retreat by a lot of entities from expenditure on innovation because of the risk, because of the capital requirements. And I think we need to look at ways in which, how can we bring some of these entities back together to really kind of focus on that?
Just kind of going back to health for a bit, what are the examples that you think of in like the health ecosystem that have been kind of successful following this model of an idea in academia and then eventually achieving commercial success? And I think the reason commercial success is important is commercial success means you've achieved scale, have a lot of customers, and then ultimately that means you've got patients and you've got people benefiting from the service. Using that commercial success maybe as a measure for the impact on the health of society. What are the examples that kind of come to mind there?
There's a couple of really interesting things. I think one kind of broad area would be around, say, medical imaging and its deployment of computer vision. And that's probably the real frontier in the deployment of AI in healthcare. I mean, there was this probably terrible quote of a few years ago, I think it was from Hinton, when he talked about we don't need radiologists anymore because actually computers are going to be able to read and interpret imaging that we use. Now, you would say computer vision and techniques are integrated into almost every, really important, especially in oncology. And it's really transformed our ability to identify, cancers early. And so I think that would be one area which has seen kind of commercial success, but I would argue quite gradually, because I think as you know well, healthcare innovation can be slow to deploy and reach that more ubiquitous scale. So, for example, we're seeing one frontier at the moment might be around digital scribing, is an area which is now really kind of taken off in the near term, and we're seeing quite a lot of contracts issued to companies who are deploying kind of technologies to essentially record and support docs with appointments and automating the kind of write-up. I think those are a couple of interesting ones, but I think there's room for so much more. And I think the other obvious one that we have to cover would be a huge success of GLP-1s. I think would be a major one in the sense it's almost close to category creation in healthcare, in the sense that, obesity and cardiometabolic disease has always been a market, but it's never been one that has seen the amount of attention and investment that it does now. But in some respects, arguably is one of the most important drivers that we can invest in now that might have really big influence on life expectancy. I think it's around 80% of diseases in that kind of cardiometabolic space are preventable. So the idea being that if new products can come that can help people within that kind of broad array of kind of disease states, you could actually see major success and improvement. So I think those are a couple of examples in healthcare where new innovation coming through. But we've got to remember GLP-1s are like 30 years old in reality, but at the same time, its impact today is beyond compare, really.
Going back to earlier in the conversation, you kind of outlined maybe 3 components for kind of success of innovations commercializing and reaching the scale and helping patients ultimately. You talked about the kind of the idea, you talked about the talent, and you talked about the capital all needing to come together. Can you explain like where we are today with that? Maybe you talked a little bit about the contrast of the US and the UK. Maybe focus on where that sits today in the UK and how things have maybe progressed in the last couple of years.
So one of the really exciting things I think in the UK at the moment is how we are really seeing London becoming a global centre for artificial intelligence, in part because of the influence of DeepMind as a pseudo university. I mean, arguably, DeepMind outperforms almost any university in their topic in terms of how fast and they can build and train amazing talent in that space, and publication track records, spinning out companies, isomorphic labs, for example, in deep tech in the drug discovery space. And I think that's really one thing that we're seeing around the importance of geography. And we look at, say, the Golden Triangle with the connectivity between Oxford and Cambridge. You see government, based on actually some of Matt Clifford's recent guidance, around doubling down on areas where you're extraordinarily strong, making that connectivity better. If you try and drive from Oxford to Cambridge, it takes about 2.5 hours. You can't get a train. And historically, they've therefore been almost diametrically quite different ecosystems. But you know what's in the middle? Essentially like King's Cross and then Paddington and London. And you suddenly see this really interesting confluence of companies emerging in deep tech and in healthcare and life sciences across those spaces, which hadn't actually happened before. It used to be that, a lot of academic labs, you would almost think Oxbridge is dominant in this kind of spin-out space. But I would say actually London is then becoming this kind of really interesting balance. And we're seeing a lot of companies emerge, even from ex-employees of DeepMind, that can then go on and raise these enormous funding rounds for new AI companies. And so I think that's kind of one really interesting component that's happening in terms of a revolution in arguably a more dynamic institution that's operating there, almost like a university in some respects, in terms of training the future. Because I think that's one component that is almost undervalued, is the sense that you need the right environment to bring the best out of people. They could be a complete genius, but in the wrong space and the wrong atmosphere, they might not actually deliver on their enormous potential. And so it's almost like, how can you curate really compelling and I would say exciting environments that can stimulate people in that way? And so I think that's definitely improved massively. And it's actually, there now is actually quite a lot of capital, essentially early stage capital certainly in London and also this part of Europe. I would say now is pretty abundant actually for early stage applications that are really, really top quality. I still think that there are kind of major gaps in terms of scale up capital when you're starting to look at the gaps between, say, seed and Series A in some respects, and maybe certainly Series A and Series B, where you are seeing a lot of companies think, do I have to move to the US actually in order to sustain the growth and pace of innovation, especially in healthcare and especially in, say, medtech. If you ask innovators today in Europe, what's your first target market? Unless there's extraordinary customer pull here, the answer to that often becomes, it's probably the US. In part because certainly over the last few years, the FDA has been a slightly more reliable kind of regulator to some degree, and almost the opposite of what it used to be in, say, the 2000s, where you would have said Europe's always the first market for medical innovation, always, and the CE mark was seen as that kind of first approval that you would want to get. That's a badge of, this innovation, we've got the clinicians backing, we've got a great trial, and now we're ready to deploy. Now it's almost flipped, and especially in part because 50% of the world market in medical innovation sits in the US, in part because of course, the infrastructure and how they spend on health. But then you have in tandem with that this capital concentration there, and it becomes a bit of almost a Hoover for innovation that emerges in Europe, but then almost has to be commercialized there in healthcare, and that we see that quite a lot. Which is interesting.
My experience of this, I've worked in healthcare, but then, previously in my earlier career, I was in a lot of other industries. And the thing that's unique about healthcare is that health systems around the world are all so different. So if you think about, say, an Uber, for example, it's pretty much the same product everywhere in the world. And same with, all of the, big social media plays, all the big kind of tech companies. They roll out the same product all around the world. When health, it's really difficult to do that. And, you look at Europe, the UK health system is really very different from the German health system. And the ability to scale, which is what digital innovation, kind of core strength of digital innovation is really about. You're not really able to do that so easily in places other than the US. And the US is a big market in itself, and at least there's one system pretty much across the country. So I think that's a kind of a really big challenge for healthcare. So kind of overcoming that point around kind of fragmentation, the differences in health systems is a really tough one for health innovation. The other one is in health, there's a lot of specialism needed. So I find it really interesting that you talk about the kind of the concentrations of expertise that are needed. I'd say that's especially true in healthcare, where you need kind of medical expertise, and now with AI solutions, now you're going to need the AI and the engineering expertise. But then on top of that, you need the capital expertise. The one I do find challenging, I'd love to get your perspective on this, is the commercial expertise. Because, while you can concentrate everything around building products, investing in products, developing the products, the customers are distributed, and it's really hard to find a concentration of customers. How do you think about that? Or do you think about that?
Oh, I mean, it's an existential question. And the sense that often your challenge in healthcare is that the people essentially guarding the cash are often not actually the users at all. And so in my experience, we deployed a lot of point of care diagnostics. And in some cases, our users were nursing staff, caregivers, and doctors in some cases, all of whom would be influencers on procurement decision, but actually wouldn't press the button. And so then as the entrepreneur, you're kind of thinking, well, actually, then we need to be really influencing and working and organizationally mapping these organizations so that we understand who are then the decision makers as well as the influencers. So to your point, I totally agree. It's this product co-creation with your medics and with, and again, depending on settings, of course, and bringing scientists, medics, and operators together to kind of build these products in the right way. But you can never actually be far removed at all from what the kind of core health economic case might be and how the procurement works in terms of who your buyer is. And so that commercial piece is really compelling. I think within this web of innovation where you have, and I was almost thinking about where your tight connections are between certain components in innovation and where your equally crucial but weaker connections are, I think is also really interesting in the sense that how can you bring expert guidance in at the right time, to essentially accelerate knowledge growth in the core team, and then giving you access and surface area to people who might not ordinarily say, hey, to hell with this, I'm just joining a startup full time and going full throttle. Actually, it's by having this surface area that's really broad in terms of access to really key KOL or key opinion leaders, coin in the jar, in the commercial and medical side, I think is important. I think as well, the other thing to bear in mind in healthcare is I often find that there can be quite a collaborative environment in terms of construction of product where you can involve large organizations, healthcare providers and big groups, governments as well to some degree, and even other startups in terms of bringing some innovations together to then collectively finance those and bring them to fruition, which actually is sometimes undervalued in the sense that you're often in a startup, you're wanting to move at 100 miles an hour and then interfacing with arguably quite slow decision-making architecture within a lot of healthcare space can almost be like a culture rub essentially on the green. And so you're thinking, well, how can we deal with this? And I think actually having the right kind of support very, very early and having deep understanding of those networks, I think is utterly crucial. So for example, in healthcare innovation, you might not even realize you're building a product to serve patients. Perhaps it could be in the weight loss space. You then realize, well, actually, is the pharmaceutical industry your buyer perhaps, rather than, or maybe on top of also healthcare providers, and understanding and mapping, what pain points you can solve. I often think about, in terms of product building, it's almost like leapfrogging. So you're traveling to a far off planet and you're going to leapfrog through a few asteroids to get there. It's thinking, well, what are these small applications that get me to the ultimate goal? Or even from a markets perspective, on Y Combinator, they often talk about the thin edge of the wedge. So you want to be looking at ultimately a huge market opportunity that's transformational for healthcare. But actually, for the first year, a small market might be perfectly okay, where you can get really tight into a really interesting user base, solve a really tough problem for them in healthcare, and then move on from there. And that might take several years to do, because in healthcare, of course, you have the issues around compliance from a regulatory perspective and data perspective, and then also validation from a clinical and scientific standpoint. Building those proof points in and then launching takes that time, which is absolutely right. It's not the area where you want to move fast and break things. This is the area where you need to, of course, be agile, but you also have to be extremely robust in your safety and in delivering that value to patients, because at the end of the day, it's ultimately saying, well, what do we want to get out of this? In healthcare, we want to go to a world where there's a positive relationship between healthcare investment and GDP growth ultimately, and helping all of us live longer and healthier. So we've got to be, that innovation process has to be including a lot of stakeholders, and it has to be very careful.
The concept of fail fast in healthcare doesn't really doesn't really track. It doesn't really resonate.
Yeah.
We don't want to fail fast, but we do want to learn quickly.
Yes.
And I think that's sometimes maybe forgotten a little bit, especially the types of learning. You know, in a lot of my experiences, I think this is really a challenge in healthcare, because we look for efficacy or scientific evidence that a solution is going to help someone. We focus very much on the learning around that, like, is this going to be ultimately helpful for someone's life? But in order for that to be impactful on a really big scale, you also need to find evidence that will people buy it? Can we deploy it? Is it something that's going to work commercially in different parts of the world? And I generally see a bit of a gap in that space, because there's so many hurdles to jump over in, say, the regulatory space or the evidence space. Do you kind of share that sentiment, or you have different experiences?
No, I completely agree. I think sometimes teams can almost see regulatory hurdles and think, well, I've got to then fix my product right now. And you almost then, whereas actually, and we see this a lot even from the regulatory side, especially in digital innovation, where the idea of making improvements to product and adapting them for customer and ultimately patient needs in a careful and controlled way is essential. We used to see it that, in a lot of hardware and medical innovation, you would develop this product, it would be fixed for maybe even 5 years. And then ultimately, in some respects, the innovation you see is actually something that's been developed maybe a decade or so earlier. And I think with digital innovation, it does offer the opportunity in healthcare to have more adaptive techniques where we can benefit earlier in a safe and compliant way, of course. But I think sometimes teams can get distracted by having to manage these quite complex requirements in parallel. I think is hard, but definitely doable, I think. But then, of course, it becomes expensive, because, within a healthcare startup, you're wanting to balance regulatory, clinical, commercial, product dev, and that might include engineering and science, manufacturing, potentially, if there's any hardware components, but that then might flip into data security and compliance. And so you might have a team of 20 people that inside of it actually maybe has almost, if you think of a big company, almost like 7 or 8 departments. And then that kind of cross-pollination of expertise internally, and then shaping how you can then work with external stakeholders is really crucial. And that's definitely one of the challenges, because you're then also having to balance the cultural differences between all of these different disciplines that then have to co-work together. Because a challenge, I would say, in academia is often you over-specialize, perhaps. But arguably in the world of innovation, you need to specialize, but you also need quite a lot of surface area to other deep challenges. And that's often where the innovation comes, right? The innovation often can come from maybe an operational medical insight around what's needed for patient care, crashing into, actually, there's some really interesting new machine learning techniques that we could then apply. And often these are not the same people. Sometimes they are, but it's quite rare now that you will have multidisciplinary experts, simply because we are quite far away from what I would call unification in science, where we look at, rather than say physics, biology, chemistry, you could actually look at these as much more intertwined than perhaps we often teach it as being so. And I think for this century, that is going to be the big game changer in terms of developing multidisciplinary expertise in world-leading talent. Potentially, that could also be done by new platforms that people can work on. I think generative AI potentially is an enormous accelerant in some respects to certain kinds of innovation. If we look at Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, and we're saying, well, actually, innovation in the future, you may not need to code. You could control a lot of computers with human language. Arguably, could that see the entrance into maybe even more advanced computation of non-computer experts coming from different specialisms like medical science or biology, etc., which could only have like a really big impact on potentially seeing more innovation in healthcare.
We've talked a little bit about the kind of the landscape. We've talked a little bit about the challenges and how things are improving. And then you've also shared a bit of a model of how things should operate, which is really around different groups coming together in an area of kind of concentration of mixed capabilities. I think a big thing in addition to that is really an inspiration or a vision to rally people. This is one of the reasons I really love the current sentiment around AI at the moment is for the first time in a really long time, you see government leaders, politicians, industries just rallying around a single topic and the possibilities of that topic. How do you think about that, the onset of AI in healthcare and the impact that that's maybe having now and say, if you were to look forward over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
So I see the onset of AI almost as our generation's industrial revolution, and that it's going to have an extraordinary impact if harnessed in the right way. And I think healthcare, perhaps maybe beyond most other industries, perhaps stands to benefit the most. So it was something we mentioned earlier, kind of prior to this chat, was thinking about the relationship between healthcare innovation and GDP growth. And then thinking beyond that around why that's important. Typically, the relationship between innovation and GDP growth is kind of intertwined in the sense that every revolution in technological capability, in some respects, has seen evolutions in living standards, has seen even socioeconomic benefits in terms of equalizing the influence of, say, the 19th century's industrial revolutions leading into 20th century big science. You saw actually like an equalization to some degree of levels of wealth at that time, much burgeoning middle class than you would have seen in other tech cycles before. We've almost seen a regression from that, actually, from a socioeconomic standpoint in terms of wealth concentrations now versus the sort of mid-20th century. And I think that in the way that AI is at the moment, in the sense that foundation models likely to become quite open source commoditized, the value therefore is in the application layer and in the construction of new healthcare innovation, let's say, that's going to exploit commoditized large models that then can be utilized in a wide array of applications. My theory on that is that means that the value of ideas is going to be more valuable than the value of infrastructure. And that means that we should see a wider proliferation of new innovation and invention that can then impact healthcare. And ultimately, as I say, actually then hit the bottom line, which is, can we get people living healthier? Can we get more people back in work? And I think one of the immediate pressures that potentially AI can help with in the short term is looking at time. If you ask a clinician what their biggest problem today is, almost 90% of them will say, I don't have enough time in the day to care for the patients that need caring for. My resources are stretched. I don't have enough support. How can we then leverage that? One of the big, perhaps, bonuses of some types of, say, generative AI that exists now, how can we construct them in, as we've discussed, like a careful and compliant way that they can then make that difference, even if it's just in terms of creating more time? I think beyond that, in terms of looking at the broader kind of healthcare infrastructure we have, can we challenge assumptions around the disease avoidance model of healthcare, in which we are really focused on running away from disease, but what are we running towards? And to what extent could we use technology to generate those or support with behavioral change? We look at AI assistants for different conceptions in the corporate world, for example. Could those be interesting in terms of stimulating behavioral change and supporting people? Actually, there's a lot of really interesting research around, do people respond better to arguably an AI voice or a human voice? And actually, it's not as simple as you might think. You might believe, well, surely having a doctor on the line is going to be more persuasive, but at the same time, their time with you is so limited. You look at a GP appointment of 20 minutes that it takes in the UK maybe 2 or 3 weeks to even get one. then turning into, well, could there be almost like an assistant by my side that's thinking about me, that's maybe communicating with my doctor and letting them know what I'm doing? To what extent does your health record actually reflect everything that you've experienced in your life? And that epigenetic factor is key, because we might, even if we whole genome sequence to everybody, which now is extraordinarily cheaper than it was 20 years ago. We're like £500 or £600 to do that on somebody versus millions, right? Even if we did that, would that really tell the whole story? It probably wouldn't, because arguably where you live is much more instructive about your health than your original genetics. And so that's where things like your story or your narrative of your life becomes really, really interesting. And so I think one thing that could happen which is maybe counterintuitive, is could technology introduce more empathy into medicine as a practice? And does it feel less procedural? Healthcare often feels like you're on a conveyor belt between different interventions, but actually, could it feel like more of a story, or more like you're being cared for, like you have the attention of the system all the time, rather than just when something's gone horrendously wrong and you need care? You want healthcare to be there for you at that time. But in terms of this idea about almost a proactive model for health that's about a health state to hit rather than a disease to flee from, how do we conceptualize that?
One of the interesting points I think around AI for healthcare is one of these areas where you don't have expertise as a patient, right? You rely on the expertise of the physicians. And if I think about that kind of inequality in knowledge, the medical professional has a lot of knowledge, and you as a patient, you don't have much knowledge. I think this is one of the key benefits that AI offers, especially generative AI, because it enables you to ask a question of a very complex topic and get an answer you understand back. I really believe that there's going to democratization of complex information. Of course, you have to make sure it's accurate what you're getting, but I do trust the need is there. People are going to have to solve the accuracy issue. AI models at the moment, I think, the large language models are designed to optimized for happiness, right? They want to give you an answer that makes you happy. That's how they're trained. They show you the answer. Did you like it? Yeah, I liked it. Whether I'm in a position to know whether it's an accurate answer or not. So I really think that's an interesting perception that you have, or an idea that you have, that maybe in, say, 5 years' time or 10 years' time, it's our pocket doctor to ask all the questions. The other thing is, or linked to that, is also the point around the AI's ability to communicate better than a physician can. And I really believe that's the case. Already we're seeing evidence of that, empathy questions like, is an AI more empathetic than a doctor? In some cases, yes. And, if I take it a little bit personal, my daughter's a first-year doctor, and in following her journey and her training, there's no training in empathy or really in communications in medicine. It's really around the science and also the selection of medical students. It's not really their ability to communicate, it's their ability to understand human biology. If AI can help bridge that gap of communication, that's a massively powerful thing, because it empowers people. And then you get into the topic of both, preventative medicine. If I understand what's wrong with me, I can do something about it, or I can do something to prevent that from happening. So do you see that as like the biggest area, kind of almost like the democratization of medical data, or the ability to analyze all your data?
So I think this point around communication and education, I think, is an incredible area of potential within new AI technologies that are coming through, in the sense that, of course, there are challenges in the models we have. We have to say that, right? In the sense that, yes, hallucinations exist. And yes, you can mitigate those at the moment with current best practice. It's difficult to completely eradicate that. So in certain scenarios, you'll often want to have someone in the loop that can effectively check and appreciate that. And I think actually in a lot of medical products I'm seeing, you have that capability kind of essentially built in and understood, though there are counterpoints to that. There was this really interesting paper that was Eric Topol was on that went in the New York Times, that was looking at questioning this assumption that whether having a doc in the loop makes the product better. And in a particular application, what they found was that actually having humans in the loop actually made performance worse, because you had this type of bias that got introduced where people, do I trust the AI too much, or should I not trust it at all and be really skeptical? And this almost prior kind of bias and actually creates difficulties in interpretation, which was an initial challenge that was felt in healthcare with the imaging solutions previously, but one that we've not necessarily fully solved, especially with a lot of LLM deployment in the back end of certain AI products now in healthcare is quite early in adoption. So that was a really interesting point, one which I think needs much more research and sort of care. But I agree with you. I think over the next few years, we're going to be able to see AI products act as more of a front end. And of course, there are advantages to having humans in the loop as well, in the sense that are there potential insights or thoughts they might have that you wouldn't have from transformer-based architecture LLMs, which are purely statistical in their reasoning structure, rather than say deterministic, in terms of almost thinking like Kahneman's type 1 and type 2 thinking and the difference between those and how doctors are underpinning in those kind of diagnostic interactions with patients. So there's some quite interesting components there. So you have companies say like Hippocratic AI, which is working on its own kind of healthcare focused foundation model. Whether that proves to be the right approach, we don't know. But I think I do think it's going to be transformative. That education component too. I think training people in the right way could be a really easy way to scale a lot of AI capabilities quite fast, especially in making training of doctors easier. Potentially at large scale, we need more doctors, because there are a lot of things that we would hope for technology to do, but robotic surgery is not necessarily replacing surgeons at all. And arguably, really, it's just a new tool to make surgery more likely to be successful, just in the same way that you're going to need a team of people in the hospitals. Like, it's not that we're going to go into a world in 5 or 10 years where you're arriving and it's this sort of dystopian vision of purely kind of roboticized team looking after you. So I think ultimately we actually need a lot more doctors. Educating them more cost effectively at more scale would be a huge benefit. I think in general, we don't have anywhere near enough doctors really in the UK, for example. So I think that's one. I think also communication is an interesting point in the sense of the importance of empathy and access to healthcare. I think access to healthcare is not good enough unless you have resources. I think this is one of the problems where you see inequality of outcome on the basis of socioeconomic station, where a lot of people, if you have resource, you might have like a private health concierge where a doctor's on speed dial for you, but almost everybody else doesn't have that. And how can AI be an equalizing force in terms of access? And I think potentially it can. And I think the things that we have to look out for here are around misinformation, around training, and around construction of models. And what is the fundamental underpinning of our, let's say, healthcare models that we use in AI? And can we make sure that that's reliable and that people can trust it? Because it almost then feeds into this idea of just trust as the core pillar in terms of healthcare. Because healthcare, as I see it, is a communications business. And in a communications business, you have to have trust or you don't have really communication. And I think that's another really interesting component in how we build AI technologies into healthcare and how we think about that construction of these core, almost cultural components in terms of empathy, trust, direct communication, access, and how we can build those into new products that might be performing really diverse roles in different healthcare settings.
But the point around equalization and health equity, I think, is a really important one, because there's massive inequality in healthcare. You could take it in a simple setting. Like I live in London, and so in London, you have better healthcare than you do in many parts of the country, because this is where doctors want to work, and it's where a lot of the best kind of health academic institutions are. But then even, if you drill deeper into London, there's some areas of London where you get pretty horrific healthcare, and then there's massively affluent people who are getting excellent healthcare. And then you take that to, say, a global scale where, generally in the UK, we're pretty fortunate. We're a fairly affluent nation, and we have a national health service. So for the most part, on average, healthcare is good compared to some, say, low middle income countries. And if you think about AI capabilities could do, maybe it won't be the peak of excellence for medical advice. it could be a hell of a lot better than what's available at the moment for a lot of people.
There's a really interesting point around how the proliferation of smartphones in certain continents led to an equivalent increase in financial independence, and internet banking and access to banking on your phone became like a crucial aspect in terms of improving financial systems in a lot of different areas recently. Perhaps there's some interesting echoes where you can almost utilize already really highly distributed and proliferated technology like smartphones to maybe be the carriers for a lot of healthcare information and new healthcare technologies that could be adaptive into existing smartphone and communications infrastructure. Actually in I think South America and parts of Africa, telecommunications companies is how you get a lot of your healthcare. It almost seems like not what you would think is right here, but actually, and like to this point around healthcare as a communication business, actually it makes a lot of sense for the providers of a lot of that infrastructure to then support with delivery of healthcare. Even if they're not providing it, they're providing that infrastructure and the rails upon which healthcare can run as a communication. I think that's really interesting. So you could see, smartphone or app-based technologies that could become, we're even seeing diagnostic technologies on your phone. We're seeing all sorts of things that you could do where you could say, take images of your skin that could then be analyzed in the cloud. And these could be really awesome capabilities to have in really diverse settings. And access is crucial. I think it's something that's been underinvested in part because I think a lot of the economic structures in healthcare bias towards acute settings where the most influential key opinion leaders sit. That's also where a lot of the finance goes into hospitals. And also, if we look at the structure of medicine as a profession, it's specialty-based and focused around deepening your expertise into really core niches. And therefore, all of healthcare is delivered on a specialty basis. But actually, for a lot of people, there's a really interesting space around, say, cardio-oncology, which I think over the last 10 years has been growing quite a lot in the sense that cancer survivorship's improved hugely. But what we didn't realize with a lot of early cancer therapies was that some of their side effects in some cases would cause cardiovascular complications later in life. And so with cancer survivorship in a lot of the Western world improving enormously, you then have new health issues where someone who's maybe had an oncologist for 20 years now needs a cardiologist, because of potential side effects from certain therapies that they might have taken, to recover from their cancer. So that's a really interesting space where you actually need diversity of approach to actually thrive.
I think that brings me on to really maybe another point, which is the tools that enable you to access data and make sense of data there, and we can see them improving. And it's you could see that in 5-10 years time, having a reliable kind of doctor in your pocket, or at least a first port of call for a medical condition. What would underpin that is integrated data. And at the moment, a lot of health data is very separated. I often talk about or would joke about my Google record being a lot more complete and comprehensive than my health record. So, my search data over 15 years is all there. It's all in one place, which once solved, offers massive benefits. And, I think how we think about health data in the same way that we think about health, which is really kind of specialty based, right? But a lot of the factors are around kind of lifestyle. And there was actually a Microsoft study, I don't know if you saw this, it's a 2016 study where based purely on search data, they were able to predict with quite high accuracy likelihood to have prostate cancer. Just based on your internet search data. So if you think about combining that search data with maybe your medical data and kind of bringing all these things together with your health tracking tools and things like that, and having a way to bring all of that together, make sense of it, interpret it, that's a really powerful future, huh?
Oh, completely. I think in part that it's almost like we saw the death of narrative medicine about maybe 20 years ago. I think it used to be the case that you would have like a family doctor that lived in the village where you grew up, and they would follow you from birth till death, arguably. And this was actually how medicine was delivered for, I would probably say, 1,000 years. And now that, based on population dynamics, is just no longer feasible at all in the modern world. And so I think this is why technology is perhaps a combination of technology and policy gives this ability to recapture that experience that I think is totally lost in the idea that your narrative and your story, and I completely agree with you, is much more instructive than your medical record, which is perhaps just based on the number of hospital visits that you might have had and going to the GP, arguably probably to do with a respiratory infection most commonly, right? And so they have no idea about lifestyle factors, what you eat, what you like to do, where you travel, where you live. They have no idea. In fact, with a lot of people with, especially post-COVID, a lot of people might have telemedicine services where you don't see the same doctor twice, right? And I think that is an area where a lot of that narrative has been lost. Yeah. So there's been some work actually out of Boston, particularly in Harvard, around the idea of narrative medicine. But now there are a lot of people trying to capture that idea and utilize technology to evolve it. And I think that's extraordinarily powerful. I think that will be part of the future for what the front door to health is. We see, for example, Wes Streeting say at the moment, too many people view the front door of health as the A&E door because you can't access important services. And so actually, if we could use a technology door, perhaps as part of opening out access, you actually solve some really major societal infrastructure and government budget problems potentially as well, which I think could be amazingly transformative to recapture that narrative. And I think to that point on data, I think also potentially revisiting what is put in the medical record. And of course, this has to be done with consents, right? Everyone has to be comfortable with what data they want to share. But I think that could be also really transformative because at the moment, that picture is so limited. I say, imagine this thought experiment. What if you did whole genome sequencing and a full body MRI on a particular population and then also took in their life story and tracked them over time? There are some countries that are planning to do initiatives like this at population scale. High risk, not necessarily agreed with by the medical community because do you have ghosts in the machine, false positives? Do you get distracted, by going into a lot of these rabbit holes looking after a big population? But I think actually some of the benefits that you could encapsulate by understanding people better is, I think, extraordinary in the sense that we're really still scratching the surface about understanding our own health story. And I think, ways of capturing more of that with consent, I think, is only a good thing. As a side note, it perhaps also solves problems for healthcare innovation because actually a big bottleneck in healthcare innovation is finding patients and finding people to trial and test new healthcare products that are right for them and understanding who those cohorts should be. That's another part of the industry that, there are a lot of work on trying to revolutionize how CROs operate in terms of running clinical trials and patient identification, but it's still, I would say, a decade behind where you might be in terms of customer identification in consumer marketing. Exactly to your point, Google, Microsoft know so much more about us than, say, IQVIA might know about a particular population where it's got to find people with a certain condition set. And I think that's another area which we could revolutionize.
Alex, how does the structure of healthcare need to change for innovation to really succeed?
Healthcare has been founded upon a disease avoidance model rather than a health state acquisition model. And what that effectively means is that we measure the success of our outcomes historically on have I cured disease X, rather than actually this person has achieved life state Y, that if they can achieve and maintain that level, will live longer, healthier, by all accounts, or more than likely accepting exceptional circumstances. And so how can we use technology to actually fundamentally restructure what actually healthcare is from like an institutional standpoint so that it is looking more proactively at helping us? And that is both a push and pull. So the pull factor into that is terrible demographics in a lot of the Western world and the extraordinary expense of healthcare, where we look at E-Rooms law, where the expense of drug development is going up exponentially, or at least has been for a long time. And then you're saying, well, actually, how can we then address our demographic crisis and make healthcare more cost effective? On the solution side, we see the importance then of technology deployment that's massively maximizing time and solving for education, and also driving up access. And so we look at, say, digital and AI technologies as one route to that. Even new therapeutic products could support with that, so long as they're sort of co-delivered with wider experiences, as well as also improving the connectivity. healthcare is a communications business in the sense that it's all about the communication of key messages from clinician to patient and patient to doctor. If we take it back to William Osler in the 19th century, listen to your patient. He's telling you the diagnosis. Take it back really to the origins of modern medicine and seeing how can we recapture that. And if we do it in the right way, it could be utterly transformative to how we can manage healthcare as a system right now.
Can technology improve accessibility to healthcare and reduce inequalities that exist in health systems today?
I think it could be really a game changer for access. I think if we've looked at how can we leverage technology that has really high proliferation and massively reduced cost, you see this in every wave of innovation. It'll start out as extremely clunky and expensive, then becomes almost ubiquitous and really cheap. And what are some of the rails that we can run on? Communications infrastructure, if we look at, say, smartphone, laptop, tablet deployments globally, has been completely transformative in terms of access to consumer products. Access to financial services, I think, has been transformational via these types of novel communications infrastructure and technologies. Are these now the new rails upon which you could run front-end healthcare experiences? Absolutely. And if we do that in the right way, and if there's a unified approach to how this should be done and some of the models it should be done and what kinds of products should sit in that in terms of the type of innovation, this will completely transform access to healthcare for millions and millions of people, which I think is fundamentally what this is all about.
In 50 years' time, how is the health system in the UK going to be different in your point of view?
Now, that is a good question. So for me, I would envisage a time where you are proactively nudged to hit goals and in which you're not just responding to negative stimuli. And actually, you have much more of a handle on where you need to get to. You have a much better understanding of your past and the influence of epigenetic and environmental factors upon your present and future. I almost imagine, waking up, having your morning coffee, and you almost have an overnight differential diagnosis on your health state from almost an AI coach and or kind of doc hybrid that can be saying, oh, by the way, actually, you should be looking at eating the following things during the course of today, because I've noticed that over the last few weeks, some of these things you've been telling me, you might need to adapt your approach and maybe get more fiber. And, things that perhaps seem really intuitive and obvious in different contexts might not be, and you might not be aware of a lot of these things, especially in terms of looking at, from a preventive health perspective, 80% of, say, cardiovascular disease is preventable. And actually, if we then prevented a much higher proportion of that, we have a much more productive society as a whole. Never mind a lot of the amazing kind of deep tech innovation in, say, cancer therapeutics or even cancer vaccines and things like this that can come down the track. So I think that's one side of it. And I think the other is having a digital twin of yourself, I think is a relatively non-controversial statement in the sense that you would have access and ownership of that potentially as well. Also ownership around who and in what context you share that information, potentially whether you might be pinged, oh, there's a new trial in your area for a really interesting product. Do you want to be part of this or not? And then you can hit yes and then be reimbursed immediately through direct transfer into your account and then join a new study that might be of interest to you or relevant. And I think there's some really interesting things that could be transformative. And I think then in parallel with that, a lot of disease states today, I think, will decline in importance in that time, but perhaps new ones will become more a threat. We look at the rise of during the pandemic, potential new infectious diseases we have to prepare for appropriately. I think that's one thing that might shift in the future, as well as we look at major shifts around deployments in GLP-1s. What are the implications of that for perhaps other disease states going forwards? Could this have onward impact on even neurological conditions? And can we move forwards in how we deal with dementia, Alzheimer's, etc.? Kind of
bringing all this together a little bit, if you were to think about, say, the next 10 years and that vision that we've kind of painted a little bit, which is health data is all together in one place. It's accessible through an AI agent that's helping us kind of navigate that, at least as a first port of call. These tools are available to physicians, so they are working more efficiently. These are a common platform so that specialists, maybe in academia, can build upon them and build specialist solutions on a fundamental common platform. with that kind of being a little bit the vision that you kind of painted of the future, which I love. I'm excited by this. What are maybe say some of the headwinds there, or some of the things that would need to go right to make that happen?
Oh, and there very much are some. I think one of the key challenges would be around a lot of the infrastructure of health and what the incentivizations are. I think within any, whether it's an innovation ecosystem or even like a big financial ecosystem, if the incentivization for the parties within that network aren't set up right, you're not set up for success. And actually, a lot of these things could go wrong along the way. I think that from, let's say a government system perspective, interestingly, incentivization-wise, they're extraordinarily incentivized to improve the health of their populations, especially when you look at demographic dynamics in a lot of the wealthier countries where they really are potentially under threat. And actually, where you've got bad demographics, large rates of ill health, then actually fundamentally collapsing your levels of prosperity at the moment and GDP. So they're massively incentivized. But of course, the economic model of healthcare, generally speaking, if we look outside of the UK in particular, where of course you have NHS driving a lot of that conversation. But if you look at other systems, you're driven on a procedure by procedure basis. It's costed on how many procedures do we do? And that's how we get paid. And so healthcare providers arguably are not incentivized to deliver some of the really large-scale infrastructural changes that are needed. And so there are a couple of solutions, I think, to this. I think some of the other headwinds are also around expense in terms of delivering healthcare products and level of regulation. Of course, we've seen a lot of these battles over AI regulation in general. Of course, we need this in healthcare more than anywhere where there's exposure to people's lives from a health standpoint. But of course, you've got that around pharmaceutical products, medical products, the interface between medical hardware and software and digital experiences, where you have necessary, but of course costly. So we need to ensure that there's appropriate streams of capital that's invested in the right places to make sure you can drive that forward. And that's another headwind in terms of that access. Are we going to continue to fund healthcare like we did in the pandemic?
And the tailwinds? Do you think we're going to get there?
Yeah. So I think I think we do. I think often when I look at innovation, you have this, what I would say, a Kuhnian moment, in the sense that the paradigm in innovation is that maybe one extraordinary shift completely changes the game and then unlocks levels of productivity and capability that were unseen before. Whether we're immediate at that moment as we sit here right now, that's probably an open question. Potentially, we already are, and that deployment race is now on. But I think, generally speaking, within healthcare, you are going to see that kind of slowness in adoption. But I think what's going to drive this is, I think, innovators, technologists. I also now think a lot of, even like some of the larger players, if we look at some of the evolutions within the cardiometabolic space and the rate at which new digital products are now entering into those environments, that's now more conducive, perhaps, to innovation, as we've seen, with the release of, say, GLP-1s and equivalent products. I think that's been quite an exciting viewpoint into some kind of future, in the sense that, well, actually, with some of the right ingredients in place, some of these healthcare incentivizations can almost be gamified, almost counterintuitively, to then promote the adoption of new products. And how can we work with that to change, to some extent, change or work with existing ecosystems? So that's why I say it's this parallel challenge of policy and technology. Can some technology shift almost then drive ahead of policy shift? It almost goes back to the obvious thing where you say, well, if you'd have asked people in New York how to solve the challenge around genuinely odor in the streets, they would have said, well, we maybe need to feed horses different food. And that was genuinely the root of innovation at the time, until someone said, oh, I've just invented the car, so actually we don't even need horses. And so I think sometimes the technology leap actually can then bring policy and other incentives on that journey with it. And I think, going back to it, I think we're in a time where I think ideas will have more value than infrastructure. And I think the DeepSeek moment in AI was one signal towards some of that. But for me, that's what gives me quite a lot of, I think, hope around healthcare innovation. It's not the kind of space where something's going to change overnight, and it shouldn't be. But I think actually we could see really accelerated change now with some of the new technologies that are coming through.
So it's been a fascinating conversation. I've really learned a lot. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.